Florida's a weird place. It's become a bit of a meme over the years. If you don't immediately think of Florida Man or Disney, you'll think, oh, beaches and Latin culture. Most people talk about the state's theme parks, or Miami, or the politics, but forget about the history. Like, did you know that Florida was the site of the first free black settlement in the United States, a place called Fort Mose? Or that Key West was the richest city in the country during the mid-1800s because of an insanely profitable shipwrecking industry they developed? In this video, I wanted to share 3 of Florida's strangest tourist attractions from the 20th century. These are Xanadu, a house of the future that was outdated by the time it opened to the public; Lost Lake Park in Miami, which advertised glass-bottom boat tours through Miami's tropical caverns, except Miami is at sea level and does not have any caverns; and the Atomic Tunnel, a bizarre space-age orchid shop that also had a walking fish on exhibit. I didn't pick these for any particular reason other than they stood out at me. There's tons of places like this to explore, and I would love to if this video gets any traction. We also visited each location to show you what they look like today. The difference is kinda shocking. It's amazing to see how much development Florida has seen over the last 100 years. Okay, that's it. So let's start from the south in Miami and make our way up north to the Atomic Tunnel in Daytona Beach. Lost Lake Park and Caverns was not, as was advertised in the brochures, a place where you could take a scenic boat ride through majestic seaside caverns. What it really was is an old Florida tourist trap from the days when people visited Miami to see exotic flora, weird imported animals, and to convalesce in the warm, humid air. South Florida was essentially a jungle frontier at the turn of the 20th century, and it wasn't until the invention of the air conditioner that it really began to get developed. When Lost Lake opened up in 1930, the population of Florida was about 1.5 million people. Today, it's close to 23 million. That's in under 100 years. Lost Lake Park and Caverns was located in what is now the neighborhood of Westchester in Miami, and it had originally been a rock pit. It was converted into a park that opened in 1930, as I said, where visitors could enjoy a variety of amenities like a rock garden and the Tropical Arboretum, which hosted over 200 species of plants, according to the marketing. They could take a glass-bottom boat tour through the rock lake and the artificial caverns, or see the park's famous flock of trained ducks. While the caverns were a main draw for the park, they were only bored tunnels for the boats to slip through. It was kind of like a theme park ride. But you can see from the brochures that these tunnels were advertised as boat-swallowing caverns, kind of like this underground lake I found in Kentucky. Miami had tons of attractions like this, almost none of them survived to the present, and this is also the case with Lost Lake. This is what the location looks like today. After over 20 years of service, a fire broke out in 1951 and the gift shop was destroyed. They never reopened. That wasn't exactly the end for Lost Lake, though. Soon after it was shut down, it became a hideout for gangs and/or homeless people, depending on the source. And by 1954, the abandoned tourist trap had become problematic enough for the residents that the police had the place demolished with explosives, according to one newspaper article. If you visit today, you'll find a commercial center sporting a supermarket, restaurants, and a few shops. As for Lost Lake and its caverns, there isn't a trace of the original park left, at least on the surface. Now we travel northwest to Central Florida, theme park capital of the world, birthplace of John Teeter, and former home of Xanadu, the styrofoam house of the future that opened in 1983. This was the brainchild of Bob Masters, who financed the project, and was designed by Roy Mason, a futurist architect who worked mainly in the 70s and 80s. Xanadu in Kissimmee was the second in a family of eco-friendly smart home attractions, and the most successful of the bunch. The other Xanadus were built in Wisconsin and Tennessee. None of them remain standing, and the Kissimmee location was the last to be demolished. But let's back up a little. Xanadu opened to the public primarily as a showcase for the revolutionary building style pioneered by Bob Masters, and secondly to promote the idea of computerized homes, or what we would know as smart houses. The 3 houses were built out of polyurethane spray, which was applied to a massive rubber balloon. When it dried, the balloon would be removed, and they'd be left with a lightweight foam shell that would be waterproofed. More balloons would then be inflated to create additional rooms. This way, the end result is a fully insulated home that can be built quickly and, theoretically, quite cheaply. The Xanadu house was a series of these interconnected white domes that kinda look like a building from Tatooine to me. It had a meshed-in patio and a large spire on one end that sported some sort of satellite dish. There was a second story that was described by visitors as small and cave-like, and a weird-looking turret at the center of it all with little circular windows. The showcase homes like Xanadu were designed to be much larger than the average American home, and they were decked out to the gills in the highest tech the early 80s could muster. The kitchen featured an auto chef, a video fireplace dominated the living room, there was a water spa, computers were available to the visitors, and the original audio tour was hosted by a sultry robotic voice that came out of handheld radio speakers. Roy Mason, the architect, thought that by the year 95, 1/5 of Americans would be working from homes like this. But by the early 90s, the place was already looking super outdated. One blogger who visited Xanadu at various points in its existence wrote that the knobby electronics, accessories, and DOS computers that raged in the 80s were starting to look like third-world office hand-me-downs. It closed a few years later, in '96, and was sold off to a company that used the space for offices and storage. It was not well maintained, and the place began to fall apart quickly in the humidity. It was later abandoned. In 2005, the inevitable happened, and Xanadu was torn down. This is what the area looks like today. While it's no longer around, like the rest of these attractions, Xanadu is easily the most famous on this list. It was a bit of an urban exploration hotspot in the early 2000s, that's how I first heard of it, and there are plenty of in-depth videos and articles covering the old House of the Future. Our next stop, though, is far less recognizable. Making our way north to the outskirts of Daytona Beach, Florida, we'll find the former site of the Atomic Tunnel, a failed space-age orchid garden. Most of what we know about the tunnel and the guy who built it is thanks to research done by Kent Donahue, a city administrator for Port Orange. Let's start with the absolute basics. Atomic Tunnel wasn't even the place's first or last name. It opened in January of '51 as Tropicolor Fantasy and had its name changed to the Atomic Tunnel sometime after. And then in '54, it was renamed to the Tunnel of Fantasy. It was built by a W.R. Johnson, who is remembered more for his eccentric showmanship rather than business acumen. The tunnel was a really unique looking attraction. It kind of reminds me of Xanadu in a way. The main body of the place was a long, meandering concrete tube that formed a rough circle and that was decked out with over 800 quote-unquote windows of various sizes haphazardly punched out of the walls and the ceiling. Johnson called these portholes, and they had no glass. You could stick your hand right through them. He also advertised the place as being an unfinished nuclear bunker that he had converted to a flower garden, but this was entirely false and was done ostensibly to justify the atomic descriptor in the name. The reality was that the structure was completely built on the surface, was absolutely covered in paneless windows, and had walls barely a few inches thick. Basically, it was the last place on Earth you would want to actually take shelter in during a nuclear attack. Being crouched under a desk seems safer to me. No one knows if anybody actually bought into these claims, but what we do know is that the attraction was extremely unpopular. Apart from the 3 name changes in its short lifetime, various attempts to garner an audience were tried. Happy the Walking Fish is probably the most notorious. The poor animal was just a catfish that was forced to hop across a small sandbar that connected 2 tanks. They also had piranhas, which I don't feel would have meshed too well with the futurist flower garden vibe they were trying to cultivate. The tunnel was eventually closed down sometime in the late 50s, and apparently left such a small impression on the locals that it was difficult for researchers to find the actual location it was built. It was eventually tracked down to a trailer park next to a biker bar at the northern edge of Port Orange. Here is the location today. And that was our last stop. These were just a drop in the bucket of lost Florida tourist traps. There are a lot more forgotten sites to cover, and these weren't even the most famous, like Splendid China or the Holy Land. In our next video, we'll be dipping back into Florida to explore the mysterious ruins of the New Smyrna colony, so be sure to tune in then if you like this video. And that's all for now. Thanks for watching, and if you like this video, please consider subscribing or leaving a like or a comment. That kind of stuff really helps us out. Until next time, stay mysterious, you weirdos.